All right. Well, good evening, everyone. I realize that we have quite a few folks joining us as we begin this evening. Welcome to Constitution 101, the November edition. My name is Emily Voss. I'm the Director of Education at the Robert H. Smith Center for the Constitution at James Madison's Montpelier. And if this is the first time you are joining us for Constitution 101, welcome. This is meant to be an interactive experience. So as we go through this evening, if you have questions that you would like for our speaker this evening to address, please go ahead and drop your questions in the chat box, or you can use the Q&A feature if you like. And throughout the program, Dr. Zaino will have the opportunity to pause and take your questions at that time. So the questions from the audience are some of the most interesting parts of the program, because this is where we really get to dive into what you all are curious about and how we can fill out your understanding, especially when it comes to the expertise that Dr. Zaino can bring to the discussion. So thank you all so much again for joining us. And I would love at this point to introduce our amazing speaker. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Jeanne Zaino. She is joining us from Iona College, where she is Professor of Political Science and International Studies. She teaches courses in American government, voting, elections, public opinion, political parties, the presidency, Congress, the courts, civil liberties, constitutional law, and research methods. Her areas of specialization are in the public sector, government, and media and entertainment. And her experience includes extensive work with public policy building in federal and local state government and higher education. All of this makes her an excellent author, and she has joined us here this evening to speak about her most recent work, which is American Democracy in Crisis, The Case for Rethinking Madisonian Government, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan earlier this year. So Dr. Zaino, we are so excited to have you joining us this evening and to learn more about your work and your thoughts on democracy as it stands. So I will officially hand things over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. And it's really an honor for me to be here, as I think, or I hope, what I have to say this evening shows is that I think the work that you're doing at Montpelier is particularly important, not just for historical reasons, which are important, but also given the current state of our democracy. So I hope to underscore that tonight. About 3 years ago, and I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. About 3 years ago, I discovered that when it came to one of the most critical questions in my field, I had been looking at the finger as opposed to the moon. And if you're familiar with this saying by Confucius, when the finger is showing the moon, the fool is looking at the finger and the wise man at the moon, you would know that in looking at the finger, I was that imbecile. And the question that I was really thinking about at that time, and I continue to think about today and really informs this book I just wrote, is this question as to why in the modern era, the United States government seems to find itself in crisis, stagnating, in trouble. And in looking for this answer, like most people, I tended to focus on the individuals in office. I tended to focus on the presidents, as we mostly do. I tended to focus on other high-level government officials with the hope that if we could just elect somebody better, the system would be corrected. And in looking at the individuals, of course, I was looking at the finger and ignoring the moon, which is our Madisonian system of government, which is the structure that was created in 1787 and remains remarkably the same today as it was way back then. And I think that's one of the things we don't often talk about in the United States. This is still Madison's government. We are all just living in it. There's very few structural changes since 1787. And so what I wanted to talk about a little bit tonight was how my view has changed in the course of sort of trying to refocus from looking at that finger to looking at the moon, which is this Madisonian system of government. Let's see. So what I did is I looked outside of my own field of literature, my own work, and I started looking at organizational theory. There's a huge body of literature coming out of business schools, which look at why corporations that were once successful are stagnating and in malaise or in crisis. And that led me to a bunch of different work, but one of the most important was by Peter Drucker. And Peter Drucker really asked the same question about corporations like IBM and GM, these huge behemoth organizations that dominated the US economy at one point, that at another point started to falter. And in looking at this question, he wrote a really important classic work in Harvard Business Review. And what he found was that these examples of stagnation, companies like IBM being blindsided by the rise of Apple, Macintosh, software, GM by the rise of the Japanese automobile corporations. He found that in most instances, there was a similar tendency in these corporations. And that tendency was to blame the problem on the people in the organization and to start to turn those people over in the hopes that if they could install somebody smarter, more equipped, better able to produce, they would have a magic cure. And of course, what Drucker found was in most instances, that wasn't the problem. And he made the argument that reason was why it wasn't the individuals was because in most instances, the problem wasn't what the people inside the organization were doing or not doing. The problem was the assumptions on which the organization was built no longer fit the reality of the world in which they were living in. And so he makes an argument that you need to go back to the assumptions on which the organization, in this case, IBM or GM, is structured. And he says what you'll find is that they most often have outlived their usefulness. They need to be reconsidered. They need to be rethought if the organization is going to survive in the modern world. He also makes the case that in most of these instances, this phenomenon he's talking about applies to all kinds of organizations, whether they're corporations like IBM, churches, museums like Montpellier, or institutions like Iona, where I teach, or even, he says, governments. And so what he argues for is a reconsideration of these assumptions. And what I've done is I've applied that to the state. And this is a quote from Drucker that I'll just read to you, where he says, the root causes of nearly every one of these crises is not that things are being done poorly. It's that the assumptions on which the organization has been built and is being run no longer fit reality. And so what I did was fairly simple. It was to codify that and apply it to the state. And so what you see on the bottom is the time from 1787, when our system is constructed, all the way to 2021. And what we find, and he finds with organizations of all sizes, is that because they are human constructions, they will inevitably reach a point at which the assumptions, or what Madison calls the object in Federalist 10 of the system, no longer meets the reality. So when we're talking about assumptions, we're talking about, again, what Madison calls the object of government, or if you can think of that as their purpose or goal. In the spirit of the laws, Montesquieu talks about the fact that all governments have the same purpose, and that is survival. But what Madison is talking about and what Montesquieu wants to talk about are their peculiar purposes. So Montesquieu says the peculiar purpose of a monarchy is the sort of glorification of the king or the monarch. whereas he says the peculiar object of a republic is the protection of liberty. And so when we're talking about the assumption, that's what we're talking about. And in our system, and Madison makes this very clear, the assumption or the goal or the purpose or the object of our system is the protection of liberty. And out of that, you structure the system accordingly. The problem becomes over time when the assumption no longer meets reality, and that's when you find crises, that's when you find stagnation, and that's when you find a need to reconsider those assumptions, maybe modify them, maybe change them, and restructure accordingly. And so in applying that sort of simple framework to the United States, of course, that brings you right to where you are at Montpelier, to James Madison, the father of the Constitution. No single individual obviously had as a profound an impact on the structure of the Constitution. Obviously, he was not alone, but his influence is obviously dominant. And as I just alluded to, he's very, very clear in his words about what the object or the purpose was. So he describes the object or the purpose of the system that he goes into the convention with, and they come out with modifications, as the protection of liberty. And this is what some scholars describe as protectionism. And in this case, of course, liberty is freedom, but it's not just freedom broadly, it's freedom from government. So it's a particular and a peculiar type of freedom. For Madison and the framers, if we look historically, this of course makes a good deal of sense given where they were historically. And I pulled out one quote from Federalist 10. It's not the most famous, unfortunately, but in my mind, it's one of the most important, because while we spend a lot of time talking about what he has to say about factions, and that piece is obviously chock full of famous quotes, but what he does say in it that doesn't get as much attention is this. He says, the protection of these faculties is the first object of government. And by these faculties, what does he mean? Well, he tells you the diversity in the faculties of men from which the rights of property originate. So for Madison and the framers, the object of government was protection of liberty. And all liberties may have been important, but the protection of property, the right to own property, was paramount for them. And he makes that case very, very clear in Federalist 10. And if we think historically about this issue of protectionism broadly and then more focused on property, it makes sense. Obviously, they lived under King George. They fought a revolution because they believed that they were not getting the liberty protections they deserved from Great Britain. They fight that war, and then they create the Articles of Confederation. And in less than a decade under the Articles of Confederation, they begin to make an assessment that their liberties are as vulnerable under that system as they were under King George. And the reason is because they start to see mounting pressure in the state legislatures where mobs, as they describe them, are starting to take power. And the threat is that they will redistribute wealth. They will abolish debt. They will get rid of private property totally. So the framers see the threat of liberty not just from the monarch and not just from King George, although of course it's very real there. They also see it from mobs that can take over state legislatures under the Articles of Confederation. And it is these concerns, amongst others, that drive them to the convention and drive them to call for a reformation of the Articles that becomes a replacement of the Articles with our current Constitution. So when we think about what they describe and what Madison clearly describes as the object peculiar for a republic, it's protection and in particular, protection of the liberty to own property. And when that is your goal, you follow Montesquieu. And again, Spirit of the Laws is written like 3 decades before our Constitution. When that's your goal, you follow Montesquieu in his dictate that the best way to protect your liberty is to separate, or what I call dispersed power. And that's exactly what our framers do. They adopt, as Montesquieu talked about, a separation of powers, what he describes as res politica. But then I like to call Madison Montesquieu on steroids, because not content with just separating powers, he decides that he is going to take extra steps. He is going to create a system of checks and balances. He is going to create bicameralism in the legislature. This is all put on top of a federal system. And what all of these, and there are others, what all of these structures have in common is the dispersion and the separation of power. And when you separate power, you are attempting to protect your liberty, your freedom from the government. But on the downside, you're making it difficult for the government to get things done. And that was the trade-off that they made with this structure. And I don't know how many of you have had the chance to see Hamilton back on Broadway after a break for the pandemic, as it is. During the pandemic, they put a live version on TV. But Act 2 of Hamilton begins with Jefferson returning from Paris, and he is going to take his place in the Washington cabinet. And in Act 2, as it begins, we see this sort of standoff, and you can sort of see it depicted here in this slide, between Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, and Secretary of State Jefferson. The standoff over Hamilton's plans as it pertained to the economy. So we're now in about 1789, early 1800s. And there's a really interesting battle between Jefferson and Hamilton that's played out in the rap music. But what happens, this is Cabinet Battle 1 that Lin-Manuel Miranda calls it. But what happens at the end of this is that Washington tells them to take a break. And he pulls Hamilton aside, and he makes famous statements like, winning is easy, governing is hard. But then he also says, you don't have the votes to do what you want to do. You need the votes in Congress, you need support. And he tells him, in order to get support, you're either going to have to compromise, or you're going to have to convince people to come along with you. You're going to have to use the bully pulpit as you have it to convince people to come to your side. And it's a really important moment because it underscores the challenge of governing under the Madisonian system. There was a scholar who used to say that Madison was brilliant at creating a system of government, but he had a lot more challenges governing under it when he ultimately became president. And the reason is because of exactly what plays out in Hamilton, the musical. What the musical doesn't focus on as much is the sort of main solution that Madison and Jefferson and Hamilton came up with in order to bridge these divides. And that's what I and other people refer to as the first semi-solution to the problem of Madisonian government. And that is the birth of political parties. Madison himself says in Federalist 10 that the sort of great evil in a free state, the greatest danger, as he calls it, in a free government are factions. Factions, political parties are factions. Washington's farewell address, he makes the similar sort of famous statement about the dangers of political parties. Jefferson had made similar comments. It was very common at this time. And that's why people are often stunned at the paradox that these same people who were railing against political parties almost at once, the minute they got into office, turned to political parties. And the reason is, of course, for all of their flaws, and they are many, political parties remain the only institution in our system that's proven capable of bridging the divides and making it possible for people like Hamilton to push forward the policies that they ran on. And so political parties become this all-important sort of first or semi-solution. And one of the things in my discipline of political science that you often will hear, and it was a little bit more common in the mid-20th century and sort of ebbed and flowed, but political scientists are famous for touting parties as a solution to what ails us in the United States. And this is why. So in the mid-20th century, there was a famous piece written by a group of political scientists under the American Political Science Association called the Responsible Party Model, in which they, understanding, I live in New York, and we were the center of all wrong with sort of political parties and the bosses and those kinds of things. They try to see if there's a way to make parties more responsible so that the system could enjoy the benefits of them without the corruption. So there's a long history of that in the United States, but where it all stems from are these early sort of debates between Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and others in an attempt to figure out how they can make the system work. And this is something that anybody who has been president or in public office has to contend with. There is always widespread frustration amongst our presidents, Republican, Democrat, conservative, or liberal, and most other leaders who run on promises that when they get in office, they cannot keep. And just to go back to the finger in the moon analogy, we often blame the individual. This person wasn't smart enough. This person wasn't, political enough. When Barack Obama was in office, they used to say, it'd be so much better if Barack Obama would spend time socializing with members of Congress. He's always wanting to stay sequestered in the White House. He doesn't spend as much time schmoozing with them. Well, you can criticize him for that, but that's probably not the main reason he had difficulties moving forward his agenda. And you could go through all kinds of presidents, all of them, and make these same cases. That was, of course, 1789, 1800. And I again stress that at Montpelier, you are in the home of the person who, I say again, created the world in which we are all living. And just to underscore this point, I mean, it is stunning the degree to which the system that he pushed forward with help of the framers has changed so little structurally. So just to give you a sense, we've had 27 amendments to the Constitution. 2 of them, prohibition and its repeal, cross each other out. So we've had 25. They are sort of in 3 big buckets. Those that are designed to protect our liberties and rights. So most of the Bill of Rights, the Civil War amendments as we talk about them, right? The 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote. So most of the amendments are 15, in fact, are in the arena of liberties and rights. 5 deal with federal power or its limitations. Just 5 deal with the structure of the system. And for most scholars, 3 of those, 12, 20, and 25, are what they would describe as sort of tinkering around the edges, technical, peripheral, not that important, which leaves us with just 2, 17 and 22. 7% of your constitutional amendments have been structural. That's it. Of course, 17, these both occur, by the way, in the early to mid 20th century. 17 is the direct election of senators. That's a big structural change. 22 deals with the term limits for president. That's a big structural change, but that's it. So when we talk about and think about the system we're living in, If you don't understand James Madison and you don't understand what the framers were doing, what their goal was, and how in fact they structured and of course compromised to meet their goal as best as possible, it's really, really hard to understand the government you're living in, and it's almost impossible to think about critiquing it or reforming it. So as we think about the sort of structural component, if you will, the assumptions on which it was built, and then how it was structured, we have, at least in my estimation, and I know there's disagreement on this, so I'm not pretending that this is, an objective view. This is my view. We have reached a crisis point, and I'll just give you a couple of examples of this. One is trust in government. So these are what I think of as signs of malaise or signs of trouble, of the kind that Drucker was talking about as it pertains to IBM or GM, similar in that regard, but I think more profound because I'm a political scientist. If you look at the National Election Study Trust in Government Survey, you can see here how far it has fallen. So when they first started taking this measurement, this is from 1960 to 2021, but when they started measuring about the 1950s into the 60s, we were at about 3/4 of Americans said they trusted the government, federal government, to do what is right. That number has now fallen, as you can see, to about 20%, 25%. It's not been higher than 3 out of 10 since 2007. And, we do have a blip, as you can see right here early in the Bush administration. And that, of course, is due to the 9/11 attacks. So I am a pollster by training. And what we would refer to that is as a sign of patriotism, less a sign of trust in government. And it's a very short-lived increase in trust. For the most part, since 2007, less than 3 out of 10 Americans will tell you that they trust the federal government to do what's right. Another sign of this sort of trouble and this malaise is what I think of as the inability of the federal government to address key challenges. So you can draw on a number of issues, almost any issue you want to choose. I do a lot of work in the media, and for a long time I covered New York City. And one of the big black marks for a big city mayor is when it snows, if you are not there to clean up that snow and clean up those sidewalks, it almost doesn't matter what else you do, because that's what matters to people, right? There is a sort of similar, I think even more profound issue at the federal level. And that is when you have crises that the government over several years and decades remains unable to address. So to give you an example, gun control. I'm in Westchester County, New York, just right off the border of Connecticut, where Sandy Hook Elementary School, many of us, myself included, said when those babies were slaughtered in their school, there was no way we were not going to get common sense gun control. That has not happened, as you know. The immigration crisis. Don't forget, George W. Bush is elected because he's a governor rather, from a border state. And his big issue prior to 9/11 was addressing the crisis that is immigration. And I know that is a politically charged phrase today, but when you are living in a system where the government says they don't know, but suspects between 8 to 15 million people are here and not accounted for, that's a crisis. And we've been living in that crisis for decades. Something that all of our students know so well, the student debt crisis. Students, young people are carrying the largest single debt of anybody in this country today. And still, the government has not addressed it. Or infrastructure. We have been celebrating Infrastructure Week. We just finally had a hard infrastructure bill signed. Many people would argue too little, too late, and we still wait for the human infrastructure side of that. But if you compare our ability to address our infrastructure problems, which are enormous, with the ability of authoritarian states like China, you get a sense as to the problems that we're living in. And it almost doesn't matter which issue you talk about. Even when the government does finally take action after years. Healthcare, for instance. I often have students read about Bill Clinton's promise within 100 days to reform the nation's healthcare. That takes until Barack Obama is elected, and he is able to push through the Affordable Care Act. But that is not the bill that Barack Obama promised. It is a watered down bill. He takes what he can get, as we have to in this system, but it's not what he promised, right? So those are the signs of trouble that we're talking about. And so the question then becomes what to do about all of this. And I think for me, the first step is to do the type of thing you do at Montpelier, and we hopefully do in the classroom, which is to have a public and concerted conversation, number one, about what the goals of our system as it was constructed were, how it was structured to meet those goals, and then to have a really tough conversation about whether the purposes in 1787 still make sense today. And I will tell you my sort of bias on this question is, and this again is subjective, is I do think protection of liberty should remain paramount in our system. But I also believe that we need to make some modifications in terms of our structure that allow our system to be at once both responsive, and by responsive, I mean responsive to the majority, and accountable, by which I mean when we as voters, sovereign as we are in a republic, go to the polling booth, we should know whether we want to throw the bums out or keep them in. We should know who to hold accountable. Very hard to do in a system as dispersed as ours. So my bias is keep protection of liberty paramount, but reconfigure the system in some ways to sort of elevate responsiveness and accountability beyond what they are. And I know there is wild disagreement on this. So I wouldn't pretend that that is, something that people agree on. The problem, of course, is how to do that beyond having a conversation. And given how divided and divisive things are in our system, the idea that we would be able to amend the Constitution today is almost unthinkable in this environment. I have a quote in the book from Justice Scalia, of all people, certainly an originalist, but he's somebody who makes an argument that a lot of us make about the amendment process, which is that it should have been hard, but not that hard. It is a profoundly difficult process to see through, right? We have two possibilities. We have the regular amendment process, or we have what's called the CONCON, the Constitutional Convention. Neither one of those is a viable option today because there's simply not the support for them. So I think realistically, the idea that we would make constitutional changes, amend the Constitution, is not something that's going to happen. One thing I think a lot of Americans don't quite realize is that James Madison wrote our last amendment, which was amended in the 1990s, right? There's not been a lot of amendment activity. So the 27th Amendment is Madison's, pushed through by a student of all people. So a fascinating story on how that got pushed through, but it was Madison's amendment. So for me, the constitutional amendment process is not one I think is going to be viable. And that leaves you with other avenues to achieve change. And these are things like extra constitutional mechanisms. And there are a variety of reform ideas out there. One that's talked about a lot today, just to give you one example, is getting rid of the filibuster. And obviously that's a contentious issue. It's not a constitutional issue. That is a rule of the Senate. The idea is by getting rid of the filibuster, you make it less easy for minorities to stop the majority from fulfilling their vision. That's one example. A lot of people have talked about things like a return to responsible parties, which I mentioned. Since the McGovern-Fraser commissions in the 1970s, we've given over the political party choice of candidate to primaries. And now a lot of people believe that that is a more democratic process. You allow the people to go in and choose who's going to be the party's nominee. We need to think about that. Number one, turnout in primaries is very, very low. So you're getting the most active and extreme members out voting in primaries. Number two, 2016, the Republican candidate was not the one people in the party wanted on the Republican side in terms of the party regulars who run the party. And same is true on the person who came in second, Bernie Sanders, who was an independent until he decided to run for president and still remains. So a return to responsible parties would mean giving the party some modicum of control over its business, who it nominates, for instance, maybe moving back from this turn to primaries to a convention. We just, and I know you all in Virginia just had your gubernatorial election, which we watched and was fascinating. One of the sort of things that people talked about was how Glenn Youngkin managed to avoid being tied too directly to Donald Trump. So he was able to sort of walk this line between not alienating real Trump supporters and not alienating more moderate independent voters who might not be a fan of Donald Trump. He was able to take this middle line. And what's really important to remember is he was able to do that because he didn't have to run in a primary. Anybody running in a primary this day and age is not going to be able to avoid that. So, you know, there are a lot of steps like that, and I'm not advocating either for or against those in particular. Another example I can give you is changing federal law to decrease split ticket voting. So, you know, split ticket voting is when you vote for somebody of one party for one thing and somebody of another party for something else. And a lot of people hold that open as, or up as, you know, the fact that they are independent minded and not bought and sold by the parties. But what that does is it enters into the system division on top of the divisions that already exist. So if I was to bet, and I probably should never bet because it hasn't turned out well, but if I was to bet, we will see Republicans take over one or both of the House and the Senate in 2022. That's what history tells us, which will give us divided government in DC. We've had divided government more than not in the modern era. And what that does, again, is on top of all the divisions built into our system already, adds more division to the system and makes it less possible to get things done. All of that said, I think what you realize so clearly when you look at this literature that I sort of was immersed in is there's no shortage of ideas for reform. People since the early 1800s have been coming up with good, you know, ways and not so good ways to address this problem of how you form a government that can move forward in our system. So there's no shortage of ideas. there are texts and volumes, and there's been commissions and studies and all kinds of things throughout American history. There is a real shortage of political will. And that's where I think the biggest challenge we face is. And that's why I was so delighted to talk to everybody at Montpelier tonight. And I can't tell you exactly why this shortage of political will exists, but I can sort of give you a couple thoughts that I have.
Do you mind? I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yes,
Do you
Emily,
mind
I'm
if you
sorry I
have?
didn't see you.
Do you mind if I interrupt you for a
No,
couple
please do.
questions?
Yes, please do.
Okay, terrific. Okay, so speaking back to the early part of your talk, you referenced the amendments that had handled structural change. Do you have a sense of why there was not interest or will, or perhaps was there interest or will, it just didn't happen, to have more substantive structural change early in the 1800s?
Yeah, there have been proposals, many proposals for structural change. They have never garnered, and obviously the bar is very high to amend the Constitution. So, you're talking, large swaths of the states and Congress have to come together. So they've never gotten close to passage. And I think the reason is that this issue of a lack of political will to change the structure of our system. Some of that, and this is speculation on my part, and some of that I think has to do with a sense that if we restructure the system, it's somehow unpatriotic, which I disagree with profoundly. I think there's also a sense of danger, and I think that is a real fear. So I mentioned the the Constitutional Convention. We've only had one in American history, which resulted in this Constitution. But they do allow in the Constitution for the calling of a Constitutional Convention. But many people fear, and I can understand these fears, that there would be a runaway convention. If you call a convention for to reform, say, the division between the executive and the legislative, what's to stop these people from doing what they did in 1787 and just reforming the whole system? So there's fears of a runaway convention. There's disagreements about who would attend, how would this be structured? So all kinds of concerns. So I think, concerns about patriotism, I think fears about restructuring. I also think to a certain extent, 240 plus years later, people have gotten it to a certain extent, and I see this changing a little bit, but to a certain extent complacent, in that they believe that the system that we're living in and that was created by Madison is going to last forever. And I think if there's anything, we all have experienced in the last few years, but it's true if you just look back through world history, governments and constitutions are not infallible. They can very easily, unfortunately, be overturned. So I think those are some of the reasons that, we haven't seen amendments. But I think, anytime you're talking amendment to the US Constitution, such a high bar to achieve it, it's very, very difficult. It was in the early 1800s. It remains so today. And one other thing I would add is that we know the framers were sort of hoping to go as long as they could without amendments. Obviously, they made the agreement with the Anti-Federalists for the Bill of Rights, but they didn't want to change it profoundly early on for fear that would show it was weak. And so I think some of that also prevailed if you're talking about the early 1800s.
Thank you. And so I'm going to combine two folks' questions that came through because they both relate to the same topic. Do you think that term limits could help the process of addressing some of the issues that you have brought up?
So it's one of the most discussed sort of structural changes, like we saw with the president. We obviously, the only national terms we have are for the president. We have none for Congress. We have obviously some at the state and local level. I am of a mixed view on this. Term limits is forced and built-in turnover. I am not sure that that addresses, in my mind, the structural problems that I think are most critical, and those are divisions of power. And I fear that with term limits, and I know it's a very popular idea, but with term limits, what sometimes happens, as happens with a lot of reforms, is that there's a major downside that we don't see until it's too late. And that is that power is going to be vested somewhere. So if you have turnover, say at the legislative level, if you have term limits rather at the legislative level, power can shift to the bureaucrats who end up running the system, because you're having legislators come in and out. And of course, we've all started new jobs. We've all been in new institutions. There's a learning curve. And so that institutional memory, it's, one downside. The institutional memory gets housed with the bureaucrats and the staff who work there. And those people are faceless, largely nameless, certainly unaccountable to us. We don't vote for them. So I think there is a downside. I don't have strong feelings one way or another on term limits per se. But I don't think, from my mind, it addresses the critical problem, and that is the divisions of power. So I would be more interested in reforms that bridge the divisions, whether they're between the executive and the legislature, between the House and the Senate, between the states and the local governments and the federal government. So those are the ones that I think are most important, and also those that increase responsiveness and increase accountability. So that's sort of my bias on that, but I know it's a profoundly popular idea.
Well, one thing that actually you just brought up in that response was the nature of someone else's question, which has to do with the shift from perhaps the Madisonian framers era of government, where it felt like there was more deliberate limitation of federal power. And then sort of this shift over time, over the last 240 years, where there is more and more federal power. So is there a fix? Is there a possibility of sort of shifting that balance of power between federal, state, and perhaps even local government to kind of get it back a little bit to more of that Madisonian structure?
Yeah, I think there are changes that you can make. I would not be in favor of those changes. One of the things that, and this is very controversial in my discipline, but I think just broadly for Americans in general, I think we have a problem with power in this country, and we long have. I was just looking back at a British ambassador in the early 1980s who was talking to the New York Times about his experiences trying to, maneuver within the US governmental system. And he talked about the fact that we don't have, as he described it, a government. We have a maze of governments. And for a foreigner, this is his words, negotiating that is critically difficult. You're not sure in the US where power is quite housed. And I think that's sort of reflective of what some of us view as a power problem. One of my favorite political scientists is a guy who's deceased now, named E.E. Schattschneider. And he used to talk about the fact that we have what he described as a P problem in this country. And what he really meant by that was, it's profoundly difficult in our system to propose and push through a program of government. Lloyd Cutler, Jimmy Carter's White House counsel, used to say, it's almost impossible in the US to form a government, meaning to do what they are able to do in a parliamentary system in Britain. So, my bias would be less in terms of returning power to the states and localities. By the way, today, some of the most important legislating being done in this country, it's not being done at the federal level, it's being done at the state and local levels. Some of the most important changes in our system are being driven at the state and local level. What I would like to see is a conversation in my own discipline about power. One of the things, just getting back to that ambassador, he ended his discussion with the New York Times saying was, we can blame this all on King George III. This is why we're in this system, because it was King George III's fault. He scared them so much that they decided to disperse power. And I think there is some truth to that. So whatever its merits in 1787, and I think there are plenty, I also think that governments have to exercise power. That's what they do. That power should and is limited. But if the power is so limited that the system and the government cannot address critical challenges, we have babies being slaughtered in their classroom, people pushing over the border, bridges collapsing. If they don't have the power they need to address those, then the system itself is also in danger of collapse. Because what happens is people get profoundly frustrated and they begin to tune out and turn off. Or, as I think we've seen lately, they begin to fight back. And one thing that I would just add to this, as our president has spent a lot of time talking about how we need to, show that democracy can work and show that we, can meet the challenges of these autocratic systems, which, by the way, are thriving in our time, right? Democracy is faltering across the world. He's right. Autocracies are thriving. If we're going to meet that challenge, it's going to require that we are able to address key issues. And there is a tendency amongst human beings, when nothing is getting done and they are getting frustrated and they're living like this, to turn to people who are autocrats or who have autocratic tendencies. And one of the arguments that I and some of my colleagues make is we've seen that in the United States in the last 6 years. And there's a lot of answers to that, but one answer is what they talk about in the Federalist Papers, quite frankly, which is that bottom line, governments must deliver. Public policy, public administration matters. You've got to serve the people. And so to me, that's sort of my bias on that sort of return to the state and local sort of argument.
Thank you. Okay, I have one more question, and then I'm gonna let you take over from there. A question about the filibuster. So, would it be possible if the filibuster goes away? The participant here is sort of expressing the concern that would it not be possible then, for just simple majorities to be making laws, and would that not lead to these rapid swings back and forth because the majorities are so slim?
Yes, and I share that profound concern. I know that Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema have gotten a lot of sort of pushback from their own party on this. I really do share that concern. On the one hand, I am frustrated by the fact that small numbers, minorities, can hold up movement forward on issues that vast majorities of Americans support. But on the other hand, when we are sort of teetering back and forth with these slim majorities, that's absolutely, I think, not just a possibility, but I think a reality. So I do agree with that. At this point, I am sort of a mixed mind on, getting rid of the filibuster for that reason. The challenge is, so if you are right now a, Democrat, it might seem very attractive to get rid of the filibuster. But then if the Republicans take over, which they likely could, you might not be so happy with the outcome of that. Vice versa, if you're a Republican. So, that's sort of what we're looking at. My bias I favor sort of other reforms. There's so many reforms, but just to give you an example, one that I didn't mention was there is a school of thought, and this would require constitutional amendment, so it may be impossible at this point, but reforms where the president selects a percentage of his cabinet from the Senate, for example, would incentivize the executive and the Senate to work together. Another example would be, and this may or may not take constitutional amendment, would be a party ticket, where when you go to the voting booth, we all would select president, vice president, Senate, maybe House. We don't have, I didn't mention this division, but these staggered elections of the Senate, also another example of divisions worked into the system. So you change the calendar for elections. In other words, these kinds of reforms that have been long talked about are all reforms designed to incentivize those people in Washington and elected officials to work together to move forward on policy. And I know, Emily, I was just going to add one thing. So, one thing that I think that we talk an awful lot about, I know I've been guilty of this, and it's true, is the division in the country, and there is a lot of it. But there's an awful lot on which people do agree in this country. It doesn't get, obviously, because the media is not incentivized to talk about that, because that doesn't drive ratings, but there's an awful lot on which we agree on. And there was a great piece a couple of years ago now, I guess, in the New York Times, where a colleague wrote a piece about this. And the question is really, why on those issues, like common sense gun control, on which 70 to 80% of Americans have long agreed, why don't we see policy movement? Why on the cost of pharmaceuticals, they're ridiculously high, don't we see movement? Why on the cost of a college education, don't we see movement? Student debt. So sometimes I think we need to flip the question from why are we so divided to why, in fact, on those issues that there's agreement, aren't we seeing at least some movement forward? And I think, whether you want to blame King George or you want to blame James Madison or anyone else, I think it has a lot more to do with the structure than the individuals who happen to be in office at any particular time.
Excellent. So I'm going to hang on. There's a couple extra questions, but I'm going to hang on to them till the end so I can give you a chance to finish your presentation. We've had some great questions tonight, everybody. So thank you for sending those in.
No, thank you. I just had a couple of really, I think this is it actually. So I think one of the things that, again, I said there's no shortage of reform proposals, and some are better and some are worse. They've been around since the early 1800s. Just to give you an example of somebody that we all know who talked a lot about this was Woodrow Wilson. From the time Woodrow Wilson was a young man studying to the time he became president of the United States, he wrote a good deal about just this issue. And of course, he is not alone. So a lot of people have talked about these. So there's a lot of ideas out there. There's not a lot of political will to move forward on it. And I mentioned one reason I think that is I think there is a sense that it may somehow be unpatriotic. Anytime you sort of even give an inkling of criticizing the framers or something that they've done, there is a sense among, many people that you are unpatriotic. I don't believe that that is the case. And so just to give you an example, the framers, as we talked about, included in the Constitution a process for amendment. And they included that process because they knew what they had done was imperfect. and it could be perfected, it could be reformed. And so I think almost every framer, but I just have three up here, has made this case. This is obviously James Madison. In a letter he wrote in 1788, he said, "I am not one of the number who think the Constitution a faultless work. On the contrary." And he goes on in this letter to talk about some of the amendments he wanted to see in it. That obviously you couldn't get everything you wanted. He got a lot, you couldn't get everything. It wasn't perfect for him. One of my favorites, not just because he's from New York, Gouverneur Morris, he said, "Nothing human can be perfect. Surrounded by difficulties, we did the best we could." And then he went on to say, "We left it to future generations to pragmatically," that's my word, "and carefully reform the system." Another example is Alexander Hamilton. In the last of the Federalist Papers, and as I think most people here know, the Federalist Papers were Alexander Hamilton's baby. He was able to get James Madison, lucky him, to write with him, and of course, John Jay. But Hamilton wrote the most, Madison wrote the most famous and well-known, and Jay wrote the least. But in the last piece, Hamilton made this case, and he said it was his sort of last ditch push effort to convince the people of the state of New York to ratify. And he was making the argument that he said, "I never expect to see a perfect work from imperfect men. The compacts, which are to embrace 13 distinct states, must necessarily be a compromise of as many dissimilar interests and inclinations. How can perfection spring from such materials?" And of course, anybody who has studied Madison's brilliant notes at the convention knows how many compromises, how many diverse points of view there were, and how they had to cobble something together and push it forward. So to me, the idea that it is somehow unpatriotic, if you will, to talk about reform, I think sort of misses a key lesson from the framers, and not just from what they did with the addition of an amendment process, but their own words. The other thing I would just add is that the framers knew better than anybody that the question of the survival, if you will, of a state or a system was something that you could not just count on as something that would last forever, that it took a good deal of work to maintain it. And there's a long series of letters and discussions between Madison that are fascinating, and Jefferson. And since I'm in New Rochelle, I will tell you Thomas Paine and others about this very question of reconstitution generation after generation. But they understood that the Constitution they were creating was vulnerable. And they understood this because they lived through a revolution. They fought in a revolution. They lived under the Articles. They replaced it with the Constitution. They knew full well that this imperfect document was going to take care to live for future generations. And so to me, I think the unpatriotic aspect of this for me is to sort of ignore what they had done, hope it sustains, and sort of look away. I think we've got to look at what they did, and we've got to discuss it, and we've got to understand in a peaceful and hopefully civil way what kind of amendments and changes we may want to make today, which will strengthen the document both today and for future generations. So with that said, I will stop talking.
Well, I do have some other questions for you. So, one question I think gets back to your earlier discussion of political will, because those in lawmaking authority and executive authority, judicial authority now, they have all succeeded under the system as it exists. So short of some other massive constitutional crisis, what is the political will to get people in power to the place where they are interested, willing, able to make some of these considerations?
That may be my, not to judge, but that may be my favorite question of the night. And the reason is because that is the problem anytime you talk about reform. We say this all the time when we talk about campaign finance reform. Why would anybody in office who succeeded in the system as it is and proven to be profoundly good at raising money try to change the system to work themselves out of office or make it easier for other people to get in? And it's absolutely the same situation. And the only way I know of is for there to be a public conversation and a push for people to say, this is important to us. And until your legislators and people in public office feel that they are going to benefit electorally by listening to their constituents on these points, they won't move. I mean, I mentioned the student debt crisis. There has been discussion on that, and that has come because there has been mounting, it's still not enough, but mounting pressure from certain sectors. You've heard responsiveness from people like Bernie Sanders and others to this issue of even Joe Biden, to college education cost and things like that. So I think that it takes a public conversation. The challenge is, of course, and a sort of movement, if you will, to do this. Because if you don't see that conversation happening, the fear and the concern is these changes only come about as a result of violence or when it's too late. One of the, the things I sometimes ask some of the upper level students has to do with whether America is a violent society by nature. And there is a whole literature which suggests that the change in the United States that is the most profound has only come as a result of violence. In short, we incentivize violence. And that is profoundly troubling to me, and I'm sure other people here. So, you don't want to wait for that. You want to have these conversations, which again gets back to the sort of work that you all are doing about getting people to think about these issues. And there are lots of people thinking about them, but they have not resonated in sort of the public conscience in the way they would need to make those changes.
Thank you. Well, and another question here, which I think also bridges that discussion from the Madisonian era to today, which you had earlier referenced as one of the semi-solutions, is this idea of parties. So we have had the same two parties in power for a century. Is there the possibility of a scenario in which those parties can fundamentally change to, I don't know, add in a more third viable party or some other mechanism within the party system itself, such that people's interests are more accurately represented rather than trying to shoehorn so many interests into two big blocks?
Yeah, this is, we've had the same, as you mentioned, two parties, the Democrats since basically the 1830s and the Republicans since basically the Civil War. And they have sustained, and they didn't change that much, they just sort of developed from 1800 and changed sort of modestly. But they've remained. And so the idea, and I know there's a lot of people who try to, I'm in a state where we do have multi-parties. They have not been able to sort of break into the all big two, Republicans and Democrats, but they can have an influence at the ballot box. But on a federal level, we don't really see that happening. And part of the reason is, it's part of our history, it's part of our culture, but it's because, again, of dispersion of power. We have 50 very different states. And so for a third party to break through in our system in a profound way, you would have to, that is a huge, huge sort of mountain to climb. One person who made great inroads in that was Ross Perot. And he got, I think, 19% of the vote, but not one electoral college vote. So you couple the parties with the electoral college, there's a reason that somebody like Donald Trump, he certainly had the financial means to mount a viable third party run, as have many other wealthy people. But I think if he wanted to be president, which he did, he made the right decision not doing that, because they haven't proven to be able to break through. So can it happen in the future? I think it maybe could. I would not want to say never, but in the near future, it doesn't seem like it is something that's in the offing anytime soon. What happens in our system is third parties are eaten up by the big two, and they vie for their support. They get them under their clutches, and we get these two umbrella parties that sustain. And again, you look at these state laws, very difficult for me to imagine anytime soon that you would see all or a majority of them shift in a way that would allow those third parties to make any big inroads. It's not to say they can't have influence, because they can. Look at the Green Party, for instance, the Working Families Party, the Socialists. They have influence. It's important, but they don't really have, they're not a direct competitor, if you will, to the Democrats and Republicans, I don't think, anytime soon.
Okay, well, and I think I might have to combine a couple more questions because we're running pretty close to the end of the presentation time, but let me try to, I think, put a positive spin here. So as we approach the Thanksgiving holiday and we are all gathered around the tables, what would you say is our sense of hope to move forward? So the framers have given us a government that worked for 13 states. We now have 50, and we've still made it 240 years. So what are your kind of words of hope that can carry us through these conversations to say, we're going to make it?
I think the words of hope, I think there are many. I mean, this is a little bit of a down discussion, so I don't want to end it like that. But I think there are a lot of things. I mean, number one, as you mentioned, it is a system that has sustained a long time, and they built into it structures so it could be revised and amended, not easily, and that makes sense, but it can be. So I do think that is a hopeful point. I also think that as we, think about sort of where we are today and where we've been in just the last couple years, at least from my reading of it, in my small circles, there has been a lot of discussion and interest, not just amongst scholars, but amongst the general public in these sorts of issues in a way I haven't seen in the past. So I do think that people are, sort of recognizing the challenges we face, and that is really a first important step. I also think for me that having a discussion about the structure sort of helps you surmount the one they wanted to call my book Beyond the Left-Right Divide, but they ended up with the title they did. But one reason is that, I know a lot of people going into Thanksgiving, they don't necessarily want to talk politics because it's so combative and all of those things, but these kinds of discussions are a lot less combative. When you're talking James Madison, it doesn't really, it doesn't really, people don't really start fighting the way they might if you're, talking like Biden versus Trump or something. So I think these conversations are, for some people, at least today, a sort of welcome reprieve, if you will, from the sort of contentious discussions we've been having. And people are having more of those. There was a great convention at Harvard a few years ago, which brought people, Tea Party people, progressives, all kinds of people from all walks of political life together, joined by the fact that they want to talk about just these kinds of structural changes. So, to me, that is a sort of hopeful sign for anybody who's sort of concerned about these contentious Thanksgiving discussions, which I'm not, because I have a lovely family, so I'm okay, Emily.
Well, we'll remind everybody to just bring it back to James Madison. We
That's
tend to
right.
agree. People don't generally have super strong opinions about James Madison. Well, Dr. Zaino, thank you so much for the conversation this evening. We've really appreciated it. And we'll remind everyone that your book is available on Amazon, among, I think, probably other booksellers. So you're certainly welcome to check it out and read further. And for those of you who are in our Constitution 101 fan club, I will also put in a reminder that next month we are going to shift from the third Sunday of the month, given the proximity to the holidays. We'll be having a midweek book talk on December 8th with Jay Cost. And so if you want to get into more about James Madison, this is your guy. So we look forward to seeing you all next month. And thank you all so much for your great questions and for your participation this evening. We'll see you next time.